Thank you guys for coming out today. I'm excited to be here with Jessica. I think the first thing is, so Jessica is commissioner at the FCC, and I'm going to just let her kind of talk about how she got to where she is today and kind of your role at the FCC, just to kind of start.
Well, thank you for having me. It is nice to be here in San Francisco. It's always good to leave Washington. So I am a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, and that's an organization in Washington that oversees 1/6 of the economy. And I think it's the most dynamic sector of the economy. It's all about communications and technology. I was first appointed to the commission by President Obama. So I'm a Democrat at the agency, and I've spent some time there as the only Democrat. I'm also the only woman at the agency, and I'm the only one there who voted to oppose the Trump administration's effort to roll back net neutrality.
Thank you for coming here today.
I know, clearly I should come here more often because the reception, I'm liking it. The way I put it when people ask me, what does the Federal Communications Commission do, is I say, I've got this front row seat at the digital revolution. Every technology that we're working on today involves some level of communications or connectivity. It's your phone, it's your television, it's your internet connection, it's the satellites we put in the skies. All of this falls under the FCC's purview. And all of this is a really essential input in everything in civic and commercial life in the future. So figuring out how we take these technologies, get them to everyone, is really at the heart of what we do at the FCC when we do it well.
Cool.
Cool.
Awesome. I guess first, biggest thing today is we're here talking about AI ethics. And I think a lot of the conversation today will revolve around responsible tech. And clearly part of that is connectivity. And can you kind of talk a bit about where we are with 5G and how you kind of see that relating with AI and what your role in that specifically is at the FCC?
Sure. Well, let's start with 5G. And I think actually if you want to talk about 5G, the best place to start is 4G, which is the current generation of wireless service. I mean, everyone here probably has a mobile device in their palm or their pocket. And if you don't, you're not listening to me. You're just wondering where you left it, right? Because that's how we live now. And those devices have more computing processing power in them than all of NASA did when we sent a man to the moon. It's phenomenal what we can do with that level of connectivity. And a few things came about to make that happen. Around 2008, the advent of the smartphone, the development of the applications economy, and the use of 700 megahertz spectrum to make sure that phone worked in lots of places. The 4G revolution was all about the smartphone and the conveniences it brought us all. The 5G revolution is going to bring speeds that are 10 to 100 times faster, with far less latency in response. And what that means is so much more than faster videos on your phones, because connectivity is going to move beyond the phone to sensors in the world around us, so that our traffic lights are adaptable. So we learn more about ourselves through healthcare and monitoring. So we make it possible to have autonomous vehicles. It is a level of connectivity in the landscape that we've never seen before, and with it brings all sorts of possibilities, also all sorts of challenges. And there's an incredibly nerdy intersection between 5G and artificial intelligence. And what it comes down to is, think about an autonomous vehicle. It will have thousands of sensors taking in millions of data points to turn into algorithms to make sure that the vehicle responds with sub-millimeter second latency to drive effectively and keep you safe. All of that takes place over wireless connectivity in a 5G world. And we've got to figure out how all of that data activity and all of that connectivity from wireless come together and help us solve more problems than they create.
So at the FCC, what is with a lot of the opportunity with connectivity comes issues around how do we build it responsibly and not just thinking about the positives, but also thinking about what could possibly happen. Are you guys like looking at any of that? And what is your main, not concern, but what's like the main thing that you think we need to focus on now as we build it?
Yeah. One of the things that strikes me from where I sit is we are using more wireless activity than we ever have before. And our airwaves, they're finite. We're not making more of them. So we've got to distribute them more efficiently. And I think that there are opportunities with AI to do that, which is what if we started teaching our networks and our devices to be spectrally efficient in every single environment and to think about how they're going to access airwaves and how they're going to accommodate increasing amounts of traffic. That sounds a little out there, but in fact, DARPA is doing a challenge right now.
Can you say what DARPA is?
Oh, sure. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a really big institution that helped create the internet in this country. They've done a lot of very early stage research in some of the most interesting technology, and what they're doing now to try to understand how to make our networks smart about transmissions and build into them a kind of human cognition could be extraordinary because it could functionally expand the amount of airwaves we have to work with by just taking the scarcity we know today and being so much more efficient, we see abundance. And there, beyond the sort of out there notion of that, there's real world consequences. Like we're in a world where there's an awful lot of hurricanes right now. The ocean is warming. We have to start reconciling with the fact that the earth is changing. And when we have disasters, we need communications to be effective with our response. So can we teach our networks to understand what's happening with themselves through data and AI so that they are more resilient, more likely to provide early warnings for failures, or self-heal when there's a disaster or a weather event? And if that too sounds out there, the IEEE, which is the Institute for Electrical and Electronics Engineers, is already looking into just that, incorporating AI into our networks to make them more resilient and responsive in disaster. And I think that's a great example of a productive use within network technology.
I think one thing that might be helpful quickly would just be to hear what exactly the FCC's role is when we talk about 5G in terms of, are you guys regulate? Like what is your role specifically?
I think the most important role we have is figuring out how we zone our skies to make sure that there are spectrum and airwaves available for 5G wireless services. And so we auction off airwaves to wireless carriers who purchase them and use them to deploy 5G service. We also set aside some of those airwaves for unlicensed, or what most of us think of as Wi-Fi, which is an important part of democratizing access to wireless services. So that's our primary work. We also have consumer-facing work, making sure some of those services are fair and that your bill is readable. We could do more in that department. And I think that's an important part going forward, too, because that's a bill that most households spend a lot of money on every month. And making it clearer, fairer, a little more transparent, maybe coming up with a more uniform definition of unlimited, for instance, would be a good thing to do.
What does that look like? An easier bill to read?
I know.
How do we build that?
I always just think how I sit here professionally, this is where I am, and I comb through the various communications bills I get every month. And I think that if I have to spend some time deciphering them, given what I do professionally, we need to be able to do better. I mean, you can walk into a grocery store and there's a uniform nutrition label on a box of cereal and a package of rice. And you can look at them and you can evaluate what's in there. And I'm stunned by that simplicity. So it's not beyond us to try to create something that's more simple and effective. I hope I can lay the foundation for doing that with my colleagues. I definitely know I have some work to do.
Yeah. So in terms of, as we become a more connected world, privacy is obviously a concern, but becoming more connected, I think a lot of us talk about it as we're going to have, a more connected world. Everyone will be on the internet or whatever. But I don't think people think immediately, and maybe this crowd does, but about what it means when things not only are connected, but are connected faster, quicker, and things are reading each other without us even involved. So like, what are some of the concerns around privacy there or ethics that you think we should be focused on when people are building this sort of tech?
Oh my gosh, the issue is huge. It's overwhelming even to think about it with its magnitude. With all that connectivity comes huge security challenges because our surface for attack for cyber events is so much greater. And then there are enormous ethical challenges associated with the data and algorithms we develop. Are they fair? Do they reflect historical bias? If you're using them to make essential decisions, is the result going to be something that's justified with all the information we know right now? So, I mean, they're enormous, and I don't think that Washington has its arms fully around the magnitude. I think that we have to start encouraging companies that are working on these issues to think about this stuff from the ground up. So, and help educate policymakers in Washington about how important this is as part of organic product development.
Yeah, I mean, one of the craziest things we see at the Bridge, or one of the main reasons for creating the community, is that the exact same issue is being talked about in such radically different ways on both coasts, but also in both worlds of innovation and policymaking. I mean, in terms of thinking about the ethics behind or security concerns or privacy, you know, it's not just tweaking the algorithms so that it is more fair. It is also then educating constituents and the public around how they can use it, why it was created, and also how they can become connected.
Right.
So I guess one of the big things now that you're working on is bringing broadband access to everybody. But as part of that too, I mean, how do the biggest problem sometimes isn't access, it's adopting it and people paying to have the services.
Yeah, we have a digital divide in this country. The FCC's official statistics are that 21 million Americans do not have access to broadband. The bulk of them are in rural areas. But I don't actually think that those numbers are particularly reliable. And here's why. The New York Times reported on another study that was done that found that 162 million Americans access the internet, but not at broadband speeds. There's
Which
something
doesn't really
going
help
on.
you today.
No. But there's something going on. We don't have an adequate handle on where service is not. And we also don't focus enough on what you just described. There are issues about deployment and access, but we also have to focus on issues of affordability because we're leaving people out of the digital revolution because they can't afford participation. And that has not been, in recent years, a focus of Washington policymaking on the digital divide. But I think increasingly we have to recognize we have urban problems, we have rural problems, and we have people being left out. And we've got to figure out how to solve them both.
I think most people, when they think about who isn't connected to the internet, they immediately think rural. They don't think urban, but there are stats right around how many people in urban areas aren't on the internet or aren't connected.
I mean, I always talk to try to make this real so you're not like lost in a world of wonkish data. I always talk about kids with homework. Because when I was growing up, if I wanted to do my homework, it took three things. It took a paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And it was definitely like the hardest one was my brother. But anyway, today that's no longer true. 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access, and 1 in 3 households does not have internet access. So
1 in 3 households in the United States does not have access.
Right, and
to
not
internet.
all of them have young people in them, but some subset do. In fact, the Senate Joint Economic Committee says there are 12 million students in this country that don't have reliable internet access at home, and they fall into this homework gap. And it's this especially cruel part of the digital divide, because if you want those kids to have a fair shot at the future, you're going to have to figure out how they can do their homework. And that's a problem in rural areas, and it's a problem in urban areas. And I think it should be at the center of how we start solving the digital divide by simply focusing on kids who don't have access to homework, because they're not going to have a fair shot at 21st century success without being able to do their schoolwork and fully develop digital skills.
So what do we do about it?
All right. Thought you'd never ask. No. There are a lot of things we can do. There's not one single solution. I'll tell you, in rural areas, I think we need to start addressing this by putting Wi-Fi on school buses. Kids in rural areas spend an enormous amount of time on school buses, going to school and going home. I spent some time with Senator Udall in Hatch, New Mexico, and we met a student who was on the football team. And he was strapping and young, and he was describing to us, well, you know, after school, if we want to play the adjacent high school, it's an hour and a half from rural New Mexico. So he'd climb on the bus with his teammates with all sorts of equipment. They'd go play the game. They'd climb back on the bus, and they'd come home, and he'd like, I have to do my homework, but we don't have broadband at home. So at 10:30 at night, he would sit in the pitch black dark of the school parking lot with a borrowed laptop to do his schoolwork. And I mean, this kid has fantastic grit and is obviously going to succeed, but it shouldn't be that hard. But if we were to wire those school buses with Wi-Fi, a lot of kids in rural areas who don't have access at home would be able to download schoolwork during that ride time. And you turn that ride time into connected time for homework. Another thing that we can do is I believe that next time we auction off spectrum, and we should set aside some of the revenue that comes in for a public homework gap fund. I think every school library in this country should be able to loan out Wi-Fi hotspots. If every student had access to that kind of facility, it would be the difference between keeping up in class and falling behind. Now, I also think we're going to have to come up with programs to make it more affordable for more people at home. But those are some of the measures I think it's within our power to put in place, and we should do it.
Just for, and I don't know if you have this figure, so, yeah. But just for like people getting their mind around it, how much would that cost to give schools the hotspots, or to give them that, like, what, when you say set aside money, are you talking $3 billion? Are you talking?
Well, we're working on it. Every year, the FCC sets aside over $4 billion to help schools get broadband connections. And we can work out of that program, or we can set up a new program. Because this is less likely to be a recurring expense, I think it'd be beneficial to set up a new program. And I'd like to see billions of dollars devoted to the homework gap. But obviously, we'll have to work with Congress to see what we can make possible.
Yeah, so maybe quickly, too, just what is that process? Like, if people here wanted to start getting involved, like, how could somebody who has the ability, technically, to put Wi-Fi on a bus, but they don't know how to talk to you, talk to Congress, like, what can you do? And sorry if that's like a totally remedial question, but I feel
No, it's like, how do you make change in a world that's really complicated? I mean, it's one of the most important questions out there. You know, the initiative to put Wi-Fi on school buses actually started in Coachella, and I don't mean the festival. I mean, sorry, San Francisco, I have to be clear. I mean the migrant farming community that's outside of Palm Springs. There was a superintendent there. Dr. Darrell Adams is his name. And a few years ago, he noticed all of his students were hanging around the school afterwards. And he had gone to incredible lengths to float a bond to try to get devices and laptops for all these kids, many of whom were from homes where their parents were migrant farm workers. And he just said, okay, I'll put Wi-Fi routers on the buses, and then I'm going to go park these routers in the trailer parks and small communities where so many of the students live so that they can continue to do their schoolwork at night. And what an incredible example of someone just figuring that out. And that initiative, for what it's worth, has been copied in a lot of other places, but it started right here in California. And he is the best person to probably reach out to try to figure out how to get this done, because it was, in his own scrappy way, he not only started to solve that problem, he's started a revolution where it's happening in other states now, too.
That's kind of my next question was going to be, how do we replicate that? Like, what is the process? So when you see examples like that around the country, what can you do as a commissioner, or just in DC generally as lawmakers, maybe as Congress, but how can we replicate that? Why hasn't it already been replicated everywhere or nationally?
I know. Good question, right? I think that one of the underappreciated things in Washington and politics generally is the need for repetition. You can't say something once, no matter how powerful and compelling, and think people get it. You have to say it 1,000,000 times. And so in every speech I give, every time I testify in front of Congress, every time I sit down with a member of Congress in their office, I bring it up. Because what you hope is that you start to bring these things into the consciousness and you get people to study these issues. Common Sense Media right here in San Francisco just issued a report a few days ago on the homework gap. And there's work going on now in Sacramento to try to address it in California. We've gotten efforts to study it statewide in North Carolina, in Virginia, and also in my hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. We're just going to keep on being repetitive until my colleagues get it. But I'm proud to say that this is an issue that over time, Hillary Clinton has spoken about, Barack Obama has spoken about, and 2 candidates for president in this next race are already talking about.
Which one's in this race?
I don't want to violate the Hatch Act and seem like I'm advocating for anything. So, but I think the point is you can push it into the national dialogue if you're relentless, irritating, and repetitive, and that's a part of politics.
Yeah.
Like,
well,
go
people
be an
are
irritant.
laughing, but
No,
I
go
think
be
it's
an
really
irritant.
important to understand that like in DC, a lot of it isn't that you have to know a congressman or you have to know Jessica to get something done. It is that your voice is not necessarily just loud enough, but repeated enough. And you have like coalition building, something we talk about in DC all the time.
Absolutely.
That is now more and more a conversation happening out here because companies are realizing that in order to make an impact, you have to not just talk about your company, but also how it impacts the broader community. So
true.
I think that, I mean, people laugh, but I think that literally is something that you can do is just kind of be talking about these issues more and more and just figure out, like, staffers are a really good resource too. It's not always the congressman or congresswoman. But just thinking about the homework gap, I mean, in terms of 20 years from now, there's so much talk around equity, inclusion, bringing more people into the workplace, giving everybody a fair shot. I mean, what happens if we don't fix the homework gap? Because think about kids who just literally aren't learning anything compared to...
I'm going to be optimistic and say if I'm keep on being repetitive, we're going to get some attention. And everyone in Washington who wants to roll their eyes when I bring it up again, that's just a mark of my success. You know, I think that there are other issues related to this that we have to think about when it comes to opportunity for all. Our national broadband standard, which Washington develops and the FCC creates, right now is 25 megabits down and 3 megabits up. That's not especially audacious. I feel like, you know, we put a man on the moon. Why don't we just create a really big standard? Why don't we say 100 megabits? Maybe we should make that 100 megabits both ways. One of the challenges we have in having what's an asymmetric standard is we're assuming everyone's consuming, right? 25 megabits down is really fine if you just want to watch a lot of video. But 3 megabits up isn't about the future of data, AI, or creation. We should have a standard that puts more creative power in more people's hands or aspires to do so. And I think it's just sort of another example of figuring out equity through these like standards that Washington is developing where we have work to do.
So speaking of standards, AI, there's been a lot of talk in DC, at least. I don't even know if it's really become a more mainstream media story, but on a national plan around AI. I mean, we see a lot in DC, like, you know, president has a plan and, you know, a couple of congressmen have a plan. There are 2 different bills on the, or maybe a few more on the Hill working on this. But what's the importance of a national plan and what does that even mean in terms of?
So I want you to roll back to 2016. And at the end of the last administration, they put out 3 big reports on artificial intelligence. So that's 2016. They're really well put together. Like, what's the future of automation? What's going to happen to work? What is all the ethical issues associated with artificial intelligence? It was well done thought exercise. And you comb through and read those documents, you only come away with one conclusion. We really need a national strategic plan to start addressing these with some clear objectives and clear goals. That's what I saw when I read through that. And I think a lot of people saw that too. And it was my hope that in the next administration, they'd take note and move to develop a national plan. But what happened instead was in 2017, China took a look at those 3 documents and said, you know what, I think we need a national plan for artificial intelligence. And they issued a plan, the Next Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan, that has big goals for talent development, big goals for industry development, and it's got deadlines, And frankly, it's exactly what we need to be doing right now. But all we have in the United States right now is one forum that was held at the White House in May of 2018 and an executive order that was issued in 2019. I mean, that executive order has lots of nice, high-minded rhetoric that all of us here should sign up for. American leadership, caring about economic security, caring about the impact on American workers. They're principles we can sign up for, but we need some tactics to make progress. And other countries are investing a lot of money and a lot of time in developing these plans. In fact, there are about 24 other nations that have big economic plans that involve AI. We don't have one. And I think that's to our long-term detriment. And we need something better than this single executive order, and we need it fast.
So speaking of China, and also I think we're going to do questions in I have a couple more for Jessica, and then you guys should start thinking about yours and we'll pass the mic around. Things can get done pretty quickly in China when there is a deadline. And speaking of, we're here today to talk about ethics. So there are reasons why that can happen there and not here. But what are the stakes? So they now have deadlines. What if we don't meet that? What happens if they win this one and we don't? Or do you think that they will?
I think that there is a worldwide recognition that being early and inventive with 5G wireless technology and artificial intelligence could yield economic and security benefits for the next generation. I think we've got to, in this country, get beyond the sort of bravado about American leadership and come up with some really clear tactics. I mean, I think we should have deadlines. I think we should have public investment in research and development in basic research. There's so much research that happens in the private sector, but that you need some basic level of research that the private sector can build upon. But right now, we're cutting the National Science Foundation's research budget. Simultaneously, we've got to think about retaining talent in this country. And even before you get to the specifics of immigration, our national dialogue right now is keeping people out. That's a huge challenge. So I think that we've got to move past the sort of high-minded rhetoric, which I'm totally here for, that's in that executive order, and have some real on-the-ground strategies. That's what we're missing. And I think other countries see with incredible clarity what we did with 4G wireless in this country. We led the world. The applications economy not only started on our shores here, it started right here in this state, in this part of the country. And the rest of the world took note and said, hey, we're not going to sit on our laurels. What's next in technology and how are we going to lead? And I think the United States has to do more than just assume that we're going to be driving this conversation. We need much clearer plans on AI and 5G going forward.
Just maybe it's not the tactic that you would put in, but what's an example of a tactic when you say tactic versus broader?
I think because so much of the future of these technologies is still being developed, in the very near term, identifying how we are going to bring talent to this country and retain talent in this country is an imperative. I think other nations are going to take advantage of the dialogue we're now having about immigration to make sure that they pull that talent elsewhere.
Interesting. Okay, that could take us in a whole nother
Absolutely.
direction. And we could talk about retention for a long time. One other quick thing I just wanted to give a shout out to is, as a woman founder, a woman in tech, you have done a lot in this space, and not usually a role that an FCC commissioner plays, I guess. But you do have a cool podcast and you do a lot to promote women in the space. So thank you. But I don't know if you just kind of want to talk a little bit about what you've done.
You know, it was about a little over a year ago, and I got invited to another panel to talk about the dearth of women in technology. And I was like, I can't sit on another one of these conversations. I don't need a side job to constantly go and have people talk about, oh no, the pipeline, next generation, what can we do, and hand wring and pearl clutch. And I was just like, you know what? I don't have time for that anymore. I just want to amplify the voices of every woman I know who's doing something interesting in technology right here, right now, because I'm too impatient to think that we can wait another decade and solve some problem. And I don't want to talk about it like that anymore. So we just decided, without any great skill set involved in podcasting, that we would just hold a podcast. And so I called a few people I know, that I had the privilege of interacting with for my job. And I said, would you do this? Would you just talk to me about this? And I couldn't believe the response when I told them, I don't want to cry about the state of women in technology. I don't want to despair. I want you to tell me what amazing things you're doing. And so we started, and we talked to so many neat people. We talked to Kimberly Bryant from Black Girls Code. We talked to Senator Cortez Masto about drone technology in Nevada. We talked to Maya Wiley about the work she did on digital equity when she worked for the de Blasio administration in New York and rethought payphone infrastructure and made it into Wi-Fi hotspots. We talked to Congresswoman Norma Torres from California, who is the only former 911 operator in Congress and has all sorts of thoughts about emergency response and communications. It's been really a treat. We just talked to Kate Rubins, who's an astronaut, who described her experience, off the planet, which was really extraordinary. And next we've got coming up the head of the Girl Scouts, who's describing badges and what they used to do for Girl Scout badges and how they're adjusting them to make sure that many more of them are available for technology in the future, and the level of interest that she's now seeing from Girl Scouts across the country. So cool
There's
stuff.
There's a Women in Cyber badge. I learned that on Thursday.
I mean, it's amazing. I had these totally retrograde ideas about what you could earn a badge for. And she herself was someone with a STEM background and was an engineer, and how she's rethinking the Girl Scouts and rethinking badges for technology was just, anyway, really exciting and affirming stuff. So it's been a treat to amplify those voices.
Cool. All right. I think now we'll go to questions from all of you. Anybody? Here. Well, he has a mic. Maybe you're loud enough. I don't know.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. To continue on the perspective of a ubiquity 5G sensor and all the underlying debate on data and ownership of data, which is a tough debate, we host last week in Paris Roger McNamee, and he has a crazy proposal, and I will pass on to you to see if you can transform it into law. So he say the endpoint is obvious. Private data has to be treated like an extension of my body. It's part of my human part. Okay. So therefore, I can give it away to somebody. I can give my kidney or whatsoever, but I can never sell it. Okay. Do you think that's a possible endpoint?
That's an incredibly interesting part of the discussion right now. When we dealt with data that was sort of marginal to our lives, it didn't feel like much giving it up. But we're now in a universe where we are going to make available so much sensitive information that can be de-anonymized at any time. We're going to have to rethink our models. In the United States, the existing model is one of notice and consent. And the statistic that I am most fond of mentioning in this context is one that was reported in the New York Times a few months ago. The paper said that if every one of us spent time reading every notice and consent policy about what was being done with our data, for whatever we signed up for just during the last year, it would take us 76 working days to do so. I mean, I don't have time for that. You go through on your phone and you're like, all those terms and conditions. Oh, if I click this box, I can have free shipping? I'm done. Out, right? And so I think what that demonstrates is the dominant model we have in the United States now, which is premised on notice and consent, has ceased to be truly meaningful. And I think that's the starting point for discussion in the United States for how we start rethinking data and privacy. I think it has to be revisiting that fundamental, which so much of our modern policy is built on.
There we go.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that that private companies who are thinking about things like privacy and ethics could do a lot to inform Washington about the importance of these issues and how to approach them. What are some means of communication that you've seen work, whether direct or indirect, for accomplishing that?
This is a good question. I think it's so important that people in Washington get informed by people who are not in Washington. There's no shortage of folks in the lobbying community who are having dialogues every day, but it's just as important that every one of us gets to participate in that dialogue. So the question is, how can you be effective? First, I think you don't have to go to members directly. I think their staffs are fabulous. You mentioned that. I also think that you have to come with principles and a demonstration that you've made them work. Because what you want to be able to do is say, this is an idea that is totally viable, and I've already made it work. Because you're going to inspire a lot of confidence in whatever you're recommending if you can do just that.
I would just add quickly to that, if you are talking to members of Congress or anybody too, keep in mind what they're dealing with is not only that one issue. So making it clear about how that's going to affect the people in their district, or if it's, the FCC, like how it's going to impact the regulatory environment that Jessica's in, and kind of putting your thoughts in that space.
What would be 3 key elements you personally would advance within the scope of what you're doing to move us into a sustainable future?
With respect to something in particular, or?
Anything that's under the scope of the FCC.
Provide all the decision-making power. I would come up with specific programs to solve the homework gap, because I think we have to demonstrate that we can fix a problem. I think, frankly, being successful in institutions today validates the institution and makes it more likely you can be successful in the future. I would also return net neutrality. And then this is a little nerdy, but I think it's super important that we update our spectrum policy. We're not spending enough time thinking about how to auction mid-band spectrum, which is more likely to propagate further and cover more people in more places. And we're also not spending enough time in spectrum policy making sure that we have airwaves that are unlicensed and usable for the future of Wi-Fi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your focus on closing the homework gap. I was an educator in Guinea and West Africa with the Peace Corps and worked a lot on bringing internet to my students. And I'm wondering from your perspective, because I was so excited about it, and I think there's a lot of situations where we've been excited about bringing internet to certain communities and it had unintended consequences. And one of those unintended consequences is kids just spending time on Facebook. So I'm wondering if you know of any initiatives that are very exciting or interesting to you that are working on digital literacy so that people use the Wi-Fi on the bus for the things that they're supposed to be using it for and to enhance their lives rather than make them maybe all the other negative things that could happen to them on that bus.
Yeah, that's really important. That's absolutely. To be clear, that connectivity on the bus would be subject to E-rate rules and the Child Internet Privacy Protection Act. So it would actually be like a school environment where there are constraints, which is important for the reasons you described. But in the end, if we want technology to be effective in education, we're going to need 3 things. One is the connectivity that I've got some responsibility over. The other is making sure that we have educational products that, really light kids up and teach. And the third, which is so important, and in an ideal world, the FCC would be partnering with the Department of Education to do, is teacher training. There's a gap between teachers who entered the profession a long time ago and have been dynamic for years, but may not want to use new tools, and younger people who might feel like natives and will incorporate technology. And we got to figure out how every good teacher gets the opportunity to use technology effectively. And we need to do more in this country to not just focus on connectivity, but also on that training component for the reasons you say.
Hi. One question about just kind of the privacy components and the FCC's role in things like CCPA. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how we can protect both students, young people, and everyone in our country in terms of their privacy, and what the FCC's thoughts are on how we can do that?
So this is like one of those super Washington things about jurisdiction and who has authority. Our authority at the agency really speaks to the carriers that provide your voice and, to a lesser extent, your internet service. It's our colleagues at the Federal Trade Commission who are generally perceived as the nation's privacy regulator. But we're really different than most European countries. We don't have like a broad-based privacy law. We have these sector-specific laws. In banking, there's Graham, Leach, Bliley. In healthcare, there's HIPAA. We have very sector-specific privacy laws. The only authority that we treat generically for privacy purposes is the Federal Trade Commission. But I'll save you this. You don't have to go read Section 5 of the FTC Act, but were you to do so, you would find that it says they have authority over unfair and deceptive practices. And that's their primary privacy authority. And if you really unpack that, that just means in your privacy policy, you better say what you really mean. Because if you say something that's unfair or deceptive, they'll come after you. And that's when the FTC goes after companies. But it's not a national privacy policy. And so I think that we're going to have to move from this sector-specific behavior to something more overarching. I believe the FTC will be at the center. And I also believe the California legislation you referenced has put in a lot of pressure on Washington to do something about that sooner rather than later.
So in my community, there's already a lot of anxiety and emergent organized activism against the deployment of 5G. I just want to ask, your analysis about, the health impacts of 5G and how to, continue moving into that paradigm that way.
Sure. I think it's important to understand as a matter of technology that 5G is not wholly new. It's built off of 4G technology. So it's part of what we know today. That being said, the FCC has an open proceeding from 2013 on health effects that it absolutely needs to update and close because we owe that to the public.
Couple more, I think.
Hi, thank you.
Maybe turn your mic on.
Sorry about that. Internet access is an essential public utility, as Susan Crawford explains in her excellent books on the subject. She recently wrote about fiber and how America might miss that update entirely. A national fiber network with local Wi-Fi nodes that covered the last mile of access with low latency community measurement networks seems like a better architecture than what private companies are currently providing. Comcast, for example, actually already does this with their routers. You can basically get access in a lot of places on your phone using their network. So the irony of moves to prevent like local community networks just seems a little bit confusing to me when that's actually a very high efficiency way to provide this access compared to 5G. So what's the current situation with mesh networks and why are they being blocked?
In about half the states in this country, there is some kind of legislative ban on municipal networks. I think that's really unfortunate. I don't think they work in every environment or every circumstance, but I think it is the most American thing to believe that if your community is not getting what it needs, you come together and you build it yourself. I mean, that's how we built electricity in this country, particularly in rural areas. It's how we built roads. It's how we came together for barns. And I think that state-level legislation is unfair, especially to rural communities that may have no service today. The FCC back in during the last administration attempted to come up with kind of a theory of the law that would allow the agency to override those state laws, but the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals suggested that we don't have the authority to do so. But to anyone who's in a state where those laws exist, it is important to tell legislators how we're denying people the ability to build it themselves, fix it themselves, and solve problems. And to me, that's just at odds with what's in our DNA as Americans, and we do need to start to address that. But it's largely at the state level.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks.
We are over time, but